talk to me a little bit about how generative AI creates a competitive advantage for every company that's in this room.
We're having conversations with people in roles that have never thought about technology, that have never thought about AI. We're having conversations with folks that are wondering the same thing. How is this going to impact my area of my organization or my business? And is it going to be a positive impact? How can we leverage it for a positive impact? And so I think what you're going to see here is a very rapid disruption. And we're already seeing it in a lot of industries, an incredibly rapid disruption for new processes, new inventions, new ways of doing things, new ways of automating tasks, new ways of just working in general. And the folks that are using these tools and technologies are folks that have never thought about AI before. And so they're using them in everyday tasks. They're using them with email, they're using them with writing Word documents, and they're using them with data sets. They're using them in all kinds of different ways. And I think it's going to be, what you're going to see is a rapid disruption in a variety of industries. And just to kind of drive the point home, I'll tell you a story. I was with a rather large school district, me and my team, and we were talking about how the effort they put into optimizing their district school schedule. Mm-hmm. And it's an incredibly difficult and time-consuming task to optimize their district schedule. It seriously takes them tens of thousands of hours with multiple folks to get just the right schedule for their district. And so we brought in some folks, we worked with them, and in about 45 minutes, we had produced their next version of their school schedule. Using generative AI. Not only had we produced an optimal schedule, but we had used generative AI to critique the schedule and say things like, examine the schedule from the perspective of an ELA teacher, examine the schedule from the perspective of a guidance counselor, from a perspective of a principal, an assistant principal, and then give us feedback. Ask us questions. What are the holes in the schedule that we need to think about? What are the weaknesses? What are the strengths? How do we improve this? And it absolutely blew their mind. I can't repeat the words that they said. Not exactly appropriate, but their minds were just blown. And I think it's going to be pretty amazing what will happen here in the very, very near term.
Yeah, and so this idea that disruption creates opportunities.
Yeah, correct.
And then this idea of something, I'll use the word exponential change, going from tens of thousands of hours to 45 minutes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, Trevor, what's your take?
I would say from my perspective, I think this is a very interesting inflection point where it's really allowing and enabling people to decrease the barrier of entry to this technology, to insights, to summarization, and to new interesting businesses that you might not have even thought about yet. Thinking of an example of this, thinking of previously, if somebody didn't know SQL, maybe they wouldn't be able to analyze data as effectively as somebody that does know SQL. Now being able to generate SQL, to ask a human-related question to say, what was the average income of this particular demographic in this area so that I can help promote equity? And understanding and getting that answer back from the data as opposed to having to write a query. So I think that it's really going to enable and empower many different sets of people that might not be extremely technical to get access to that data. I also think it's going to save a lot of time. I think that people that effectively leverage this technology can go from reading hundreds of documents to reading summarizations and using that to find point where they dig into the material deeper. So it's going to save you significant amount of time. It's going to also bring you to the level where you can create a level playing field for anybody that you bring on as part of your organization or for yourselves as you intend to use this technology more and more effectively. One example that I saw of this recently is one of the organizations I was working with said, hey, I have this virtual agent. I invested a lot of money in order to create this virtual agent, and I created 20 or 30 different things that it can answer. They're like, how can I use generative AI to make this better? We sat down with them. We said, let's point this at your website, and let's allow it to use the information from only your website to answer the questions from all of these other hundreds of things you have on your website. And within a matter of an hour, they were able to have a virtual agent that not only answered the 30 questions that they wanted to answer very specifically, but also all of the other things that were within their website in order to provide that value to their customers, their constituents, and everyone in the world.
Yeah, so, and I think if you're in the audience and you're a startup company or you're thinking about this, you're looking for those pain points, where you can come in and augment what's already going on. If you're an existing company, hopefully you know what your pain points are, and you're trying to figure those things out. I'll tell you one story that resonated with me. I had to do an external assessment of a academic medical university in a different state, and I went in and I looked at the policies that they had around handling HIPAA data, restricted data. They had 18 policies, each of which were about 10 pages long, and they were 100% correct and right, using passive verbs for everything. So you know, someone trying to do the right thing, you got to read 180 pages of documentation written in the passive voice, and no one has time for that. And generative AI, through summarization or through helping people write those documents better and integrating them. And what we were able to do is actually run, as you said, we just pointed it at that website. Now we've got a search bar that has a generative AI, you know, LLM underneath it that's able to access that. All right, well, very good. Let's move to another question. Let's change the perspective now. And instead of looking at the company level in this idea of creating a competitive advantage during a time of disruption to create opportunities, let's look at generative AI from the process of how do we touch, I'll use the verb, it's the only verb I'll use at UAB, delight. How do you delight? How do you form an emotional connection with every employee using generative AI? So how is generative AI going to touch everyone or influence how they do their work? And Trevor, let's start with you this time.
Yeah, so I'd say from my side, I want to start out with a couple personas. And I think that's going to be the best way to talk about this delight that's brought to the individuals. So I'll start out with, let's say, an analyst within an organization that's required to do research and required to find a whole bunch of information and go through it. Similar to the example I gave before, being able to leverage a technology to help with that initial search, that initial information, and help summarize all of the information that's available there. Pretty straightforward use case, similar to what you'd see in a Google search, but being able to not just click on links, but have the summarization of what do these things mean from a conceptual standpoint. I think another persona that I want to call out is executives. I think executives many times will go to somebody on their team and say, could you help me understand this data? Or could you pull a report for this? When you ask for that report, the person might have to go query a database. They might have to go unleash some documents, summarize it, make a graph, and then hand it back to you. That could take an hour, it could take a couple days. Instead, enabling and empowering these models to do that for you, to get you that information. And then finally, the other example that I'll give is a technologist, somebody that might know SQL already, but might want a starting point. If there are any developers in the room, I'm sure you've probably heard of this little thing called Stack Overflow before, where you might go to find little snippets of code. What if you could now type something, have a generative model create a small piece of code, and then you could validate it. Then you could have that as a starting point, instead of either starting from scratch, starting from code on the public internet, and start with something that's actually built to the standards of your organization and will meet with the existing code bases you have. So just a few ways that I think individuals, whether it's a technologist, whether it's an executive, whether it's someone like an analyst, could be delighted with this new technology.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think I completely agree with everything that Trevor just said. You know, one of the things that I think we'll see will be that there would be this idea of the AI assistant working alongside every person in every type of role, whether you're the executive, the C-level, running a company, making impactful decisions, or you're even a secretary that is sending emails and Word documents. Everyone eventually, I think, will have this AI assistant that will help improve and automate a lot of the really mundane things that you probably do day in and day out. I know that there are lots of ways that Microsoft is building a kind of AI into their tools so that everyone has that AI experience where they're working in their tool set, whether that's Word or PowerPoint or whatever it might be. And so and I can just tell you that kind of what I've seen anecdotally, Kurt, is that most folks who come and ask for help with something around generative AI, what it boils down to is they have data and they want to have a conversation with it. That's what it is at the most basic level. It could be documents, it could be databases, it could be files. And when you talk about really large data sets like PDF documents that are hundreds and hundreds of pages long, and maybe it's around policy or employee documents or all kinds of things, right? Searching through that is a really terrible experience, right? Nobody wants to spend hours trying to figure out, where is the travel policy and how do I submit expenses and do all those kinds of things, especially if you're a new employee. But generative AI can make some of those things extremely easy. And so having the ability to use generative AI to have a conversation with your most important data sets, whether we're talking about external data sets that your customers may be using, maybe purchase histories or experiences they have in your applications or your websites or how they interact with you, or whether you're an employee at a company and you're doing a day-to-day job where you're having conversations, maybe you're writing documents, you're building presentations, you're working with data. Generative AI will play a role, and we really see that. I think eventually what we'll see is this AI co-pilot working alongside you every step of the way, whether you're building those presentations or using Excel for data crunching or even doing development work, right? Like Trevor mentioned, right? Somebody helping you code. And it's going to be a really incredible shift, I think, away from having to really have like kind of deep niche expertise and maybe benefiting from having maybe a broad area of expertise, maybe where you're not as deep in certain spaces, but generative AI can fill in the gaps and help you be successful in the areas where maybe you don't have that deep niche expertise.
Right. And so I think this idea, Trevor, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'll add one more thing. One thing that I think Dustin said that's very important to that section, he said assistant many times. I think from my perspective, one place to be very cognizant of right now is it's really meant to help. I would still expect anyone in this room that's using it to check the answer, to use it as an assistant, not a replacement at this point. I think as we move forward, there might be ways that it can be used more and more, but I do not see this as a replacement at this point. Really, that word assistant is my favorite word, really in all of these responses and all of these conversations, because it is a great way to allow an employee, allow an individual to move from doing mundane tasks that are very simple, very frankly tedious, to look up information or to summarize or to start from a blank page, and enable and empower them to do more high-level tasks that truly allow them to have the impact on the world, your company, and individuals the way that they should.
Yeah, and just to add to that quickly, absolutely right. I think the key here, right, is what we're talking about is like people at the center of AI, right? We're not talking about like replacing people with AI yet. We're not like talking about Skynet and Terminator, and I mean, not yet anyways. But we're talking about people at the center of AI, people using AI tools to do their job better. And so as you're thinking about like how does AI fit within your company strategy, within your organization, I think what we'll see is right now is an incredibly critical time, Kurt. Mm-hmm. We're just at the beginning of this, right? This is very early, and it's a race, right? In terms of competitiveness, right? To see who can innovate the most quickly and the most effectively, right? And I think what you'll see here in the next 5 years is it will be obvious the companies that got out of the starting gate quickly and started using generative AI in very creative and unusual ways to improve the kinds of outcomes that they're trying to achieve. And then the companies that were slow out of the starting block and they're trying to figure out, okay, well, do I have a cohesive data strategy? Where does my sensitive data live at? Where is my data? How do I bring it together? How do I clean it, right? And how do I prep it for AI? Those ones that are still trying to figure that out are going to be left in the dust.
Yeah, and I've always had the conversation at UAB of humans are great, AI is great. When you combine the two, you get something truly unique that is better than each of them individually. The other thought on this, so let's peel back this idea. If we're going to build AI into all of the work products, it's going to be in Bing, it's going to be in Google Search, it's going to be in the Office suite and the Google suite. It's going to be in Salesforce and Tableau and all of these other products. If you're a young entrepreneur, it seems somewhat foolish to go and compete against Microsoft, Google, or Salesforce. And if you don't mind the hockey metaphor, you want to skate to where the puck's going to be, not where the puck is today. That means for these companies, they should be building on top of that. They should be thinking about a world, let's say a year from now, where AI is embedded in all of these products. It may not be perfect, but what things are these guys going to miss? What pain points are they going to miss? What integration points? How can you get better answers out of that initial draft that comes out? So let's peel that back. If you're in the audience and you're thinking about starting up a company, again, you're probably not, maybe you are, going to go out and say, hey, I think I can do AI inside, Google Docs or Word better than Microsoft and Google. That's a starting point, probably not a good one. What would they do if AI is embedded into all of that? What should they be thinking about? Where's the puck going to be in a year? Let's not go 5 years. 5 years is kind of crazy, but because a lot of things are going to change. But given what Microsoft and Google are doing today, where should they be targeting a year out from now? Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think it's a good question. I was having a conversation with a colleague the other day, and there are folks that think that generative AI, this new version of AI, will be more disruptive than the invention of the internet.
Yes.
Right, and I think I agree that the potential is there, certainly is there, especially when you start using it. It is very mind-blowing, some of the things that you can accomplish. And so even trying to predict, like, what is going to be happening in a year is a difficult question to answer. I think what I would say is that nothing is off the table, right? Nothing is off the table. And we were having the conversation earlier back in the waiting area, and we said, well, what is an industry that is not going to be affected by generative AI? And I know Trevor was joking when he said barbers, right? Barbers. But I think if we put our heads together, right, we probably could come up with some really good use cases where a barber could use generative AI to improve the way that they run their business and the way that they serve their customers and give people really snazzy haircuts. Mm-hmm. But I think nothing is off the table. And what I would say in kind of preparation for the future, now is the time to capitalize and lay foundation for where the future will be. It's hard to predict, right? We don't know what kinds of new forms of generative AI might be out there in the next 1 to 3 years, right? Really hard to predict. But we can start doing some things, I think, right now in preparation for that. Things like maybe establishing guidelines for your organization around what is AI going to look like for my company, right? Microsoft and Google, right? We've got our own forms of, the principles of responsible AI and how we tackle AI within our companies, and we certainly provide those things for our customers so that you have a starting point, templates to kind of help you wrap your mind around what is AI going to look like for your organization. But you have to figure that out, right? Microsoft and Google can't tell you. We can give you advice, but we can't tell you this is what you should do and you need to do these things, right? Some of that is you're going to have to figure out. So things like, what are the best practices for my company? What are the responsibilities and principles that I need to be building so that way I'm guiding the folks in my company? What is appropriate use of AI look like within my organization? I think that's when I'm talking about laying a foundation to be successful in the future, that's what I'm talking about. And not just coming up with your own guidelines for how AI is going to look, but also doing things like building a center of excellence within your organization. The people that are going to be your AI champions, the people that are going to help the AI researchers and the developers and the stakeholders collaborate together to figure out, what does AI look like for my organization, but also, innovate, experiment, try new things, right? So I think laying that foundation in terms of setting yourself up for success in the future is incredibly critical, but also having a cohesive data strategy too. How do we store and clean and massage and prepare data for AI? Because you can't have good AI without good data, and so those are things you need to be doing now. Remember, I mentioned earlier, in the next 3 to 5 years, it's going to be obvious the companies that were forward thinking in terms of what they're doing with their data and how they're developing their data and AI strategies. And so now is the time to be laying that foundation in terms of what is our company's and what is our organization's approach to AI going to look like.
Okay. So, and let me add a little bit to that. I will tell you, because UAB has been focused on there are no companies in the world that are out there providing consulting services of how do you capture these guiding principles and then turn them into personas that help that when a question is posed to the university, it is answered this way. So there are no companies doing that right now. It is something that will be needed. There is no companies out there that I'm aware of that are providing services, consulting services, so that you do not build bias into these systems and discriminate with these systems that reinforce stereotypes. Again, those companies, at least as far as I know, don't exist. There's not a company out there that helps you with what are our principles. Microsoft helps a bit, and Google helps a bit, but it's not your core business. It's never going to be your core business. Those companies don't exist today. There is a real demand for those companies, for someone that provides services like that understand there's going to be I don't want to say it's an ethics layer, but there's a layer that is associated with principles and values associated with the company and how do we do things, the culture of the company, and how we're going to answer questions and get things done.
Yeah, and just to add on to that too, right? And frankly, I think it would probably be inappropriate of Microsoft to tell you like these are what your principles should be, right? Because you need to figure those things out. I know from the Microsoft perspective, we have kind of built our 6 guiding principles around what is the responsible use of AI, and it includes things like fairness, privacy and security, transparency. There's other things that make up those 6 principles of responsible AI. And we share that with our customers to give them a starting point. Say, hey, look, this is what we think about. What does responsible AI look like within the world of Microsoft? And the idea is so that we can help you kind of have a starting point and start to form your own principles, your own guidelines, and what the use of responsible AI looks like within your organization.
Yeah, and Trevor, so you get 2 options. You can pursue this conversation of where do we want to be in a year? How do you skate to that? Or this conversation of what do you do right now to prepare? Or you can do both.
I do want to do both.
All right, you go, man. You go.
But we'll start with the first one, the question about where will we be in a year? And I think what that question was alluding to as well was where are the gaps? Where are the potential gaps in terms of the things that the Microsofts, the Googles of the world are working on? What I would say in terms of that, opportunities that you might see individually, look at the niches where each one of you performs, the things that you know that the Googles, the Microsofts might not be building specialized models for, we'll say, entomology and the study of bugs. Maybe you're an expert in bugs. Maybe you can build something that's perfect, built upon the base models that our companies provide. Maybe you can build a fine-tuned product or something that does that. In terms of in the larger products like the Google Workspace or the O365 space, there might be add-ons you can work on. There might be things you can work to collaborate on. Those are a little bit harder to collaborate with sometimes. But I do think in terms of general generative AI, I think there are a lot of niches where each one of you could individually have skills where you can find a niche and really become the expert leveraging those technologies in that particular field of study and such forth. Shifting over to the other question, very important and very central. When we look at how do I prevent bias in my models? How do I do this socially responsibly? Dustin talked about some of the Microsoft guiding principles. Google has the same. I believe we have 7. I know it's not a competition, but we do have one more. All jokes aside, our principles are very aligned to the Microsoft ones. Looking at being socially beneficial, accountability, being able to attribute information you get, instead of coming out of a black box and saying, here's the answer, maybe being able to say, here are the links to the places where I received this information or how I derived this answer. So showing the work to your homework from that perspective and being able to ensure that you have that. To Kurt's point before, as Google, as Microsoft, it's really hard for us to mandate something on your organization to say these are the principles that you should follow. And I do think that is a journey that each one of you should start to consider. How do we want to do this? I do think, though, when I walk into rooms, the first thing I say is, to Dustin's point before, let's make sure we have your data ready. Let's make sure you understand your data. And frankly, let's make sure you understand, is there bias in your existing data sets? Because there is no way, as of this point, where a model is just going to take bias out of there. It's going to take your model and your data and then potentially expand that even further. So I think setting that strong foundation in the understanding of your data and the understanding of your principles is really pivotal in order to make sure that you can move along this journey in a successful, fair, equitable, and reasonable manner.
Very good. So I'm going to bring up two more examples that I don't think exist. They're not companies doing this right now. The first one, if you were to go into ChatGPT, I'm just going to beat up on ChatGPT for a second, and you say, when is the UAB commencement for the summer? It will give you the commencement from 2021 because that's when it scanned the data. It's not a error in the model, but it took a lossy picture of the internet back in 2021, and that's what came out of it. Why did it do that? Well, it might have been because we built the websites wrong. And instead of putting a concrete date, we should have pointed to an authoritative source that we always kept up and that you can find the correct data. So there's going to be a need for consulting companies that come in, scan your public-facing websites, and say, here's where you built it where it was fine for humans, and it's horrible for generative AI engines to scan that information. And then I would argue, as we've talked, and I think, Trevor, both of you teased this out, the stuff that's on the public web, that you have on your company's public web, that's all being scraped. Everybody can see that. But your crown jewels, the data that you have behind firewalls that no one can see, that's your competitive advantage. And how do you build and leverage generative AI to use that data to create a competitive advantage for your company? I tell you what I'm going to do. We have 11 minutes and 44 seconds left because there's a big monitor over here telling me I have 11 minutes 44. Let's open it up to questions from the floor about generative AI. We didn't get through all the questions, but that's fine. I didn't think we were.
It's all right. They're good questions.
They're good questions. But what questions do we have from the most important people in the room? And that's you.
So this question is really for both of you. What's captured the public narrative is this idea of generative AI through Bard or ChatGPT and the advances that are made where both Google and Microsoft have kind of indexed the internet, right? But most of the people in here are entrepreneurs, right? Or work for companies. Like, walk me through the differences between kind of the consumer version of generative AI and how businesses can use their own data differently, or how those products themselves are differently and how companies use them.
Awesome. I'll start on that one. So thank you for calling that out. This is one of my favorite talking points regarding this. There is a difference between the ChatGPTs and the Bards of the world and the private Google Vertex AI services or the private Microsoft services from that perspective. So the way to do it is to really work with the vendor to say, I want a private environment. You create your private environment. That is going to be, I'll speak from the Google side, it's going to be secluded to you. The data inside of it is your own. The model created inside of it is your own. The questions asked to it, which may or may not include HIPAA data, PHI data, and such forth, is your own, and the logs are your own. It sits inside of your environment, and you can say, I only want to train this on my private documents or my internal website. You have the option of saying, I also want to use the information from the public internet. In Google's case, that model is frozen, whereas the questions you ask are not being fed into the Google frozen model that's publicly available. So making sure you have that, and to the point before, making sure you have organizational standards and communicate to your employees to say, this is what to use. Please do not use ChatGPT or Bard to put in a private document and say, summarize this. Not a good idea in general. So making sure you do that pre-work to make sure you educate your employees on that, and then making sure you set up that private instance where you own the information inside.
Yeah, and Trevor, right, that last point you made about like providing guidelines for your organization around, hey, don't go out to, the public ChatGPT or any other AI and start putting in like sensitive ERP data, right, or PII or anything like that. And that is a tricky part to this too, right? Because like we all have AI, we all use AI. Everybody's got AI in their pocket right now, right? And we're used to using AI with Netflix, and so there is the kind of this risk of a comfort, an inappropriate comfort with using AI. But I think when we talk about like the difference between just this public version of AI and then the kind of the specific versions of generative AI that you might deploy within an organization to use with like what Kurt called the crown jewels, right? Microsoft does the same thing, right? Providing a secured environment, right? We talked about this idea of a walled garden where I control what data sets go in, what data sets come out, who gets access to that information, who doesn't get access to that information. And that's probably the biggest difference between any of the public versions of generative AI that you're going to use, is that when you deploy it within an enterprise setting, whether that's in Google Cloud or in Azure, you have full control over who is using that information, right? What data sets do I want to present to my OpenAI models or my AI models? What data sets do I want to not present, right? And how do I control that and govern all of that? And like I said earlier, that's probably where we spend most of our time in conversations with customers, is figuring out, helping them have a conversation with their data in a safe and secure and governed and administered way.
Very good. And I would tell you, if you look at, I'll just tell you what Gartner told me. I said, so who's the expert on building walled gardens? And they go, no one. We haven't figured it out. There are tools that facilitate it. So the technical pieces are there. But again, if you're thinking about a startup company, we don't know how to solve this problem yet. And everyone's going to want to do it. Everyone's going to want to build a walled garden. No one fully knows how to do it. Next question, please.
Hi, I'm super interested about algorithmic bias, and when I heard that Microsoft and Google have like a list of principles in order to prevent bias, it made me think about ways companies who already have bias in their system, ways they can do to mitigate that. Do you guys have any ideas on how they can do that?
I can just speak from the Microsoft standpoint. So those 6 principles of responsible AI that I mentioned earlier, right? You can find those on the web. You could not Google, but Bing them and find them.
Or both.
Or both, and see. Yeah, it's fine. But you can search for those things, and so those 6 principles aren't just like some really feel-good, like fluffy words that we put on the website. So people are like, oh, look, Microsoft's thinking about these things, right? We actually operationalize those, and so Microsoft provides tools to help you evaluate your AI solutions. And there are frameworks that Microsoft provided, and even development projects that will help you do things like assess for bias, monitor for bias, and then even deploy solutions that you're continually checking for bias. And so this is something that Microsoft takes very seriously, and this has actually been around for a while, not just since generative AI came out. I mean, Google and Microsoft have had AI solutions for a very long time now. The generative AI stuff is just kind of the new exciting stuff. But those principles of responsible AI also apply to what we're doing with generative AI. And so you can find those tools and resources. Those are things that Microsoft makes freely available to anybody that wants to have access to those, so they can start taking advantage of those. That's a great question.
And I would say from the Google perspective, very similarly, there are offerings within our cloud services that will allow you to monitor these sorts of things. For example, if you're building some sort of model or predictive model, being able to see feature importance and understand, okay, this particular element was weighted heavily in this decision or this prediction, to help you understand, oh, well, that's maybe an element that I should not use in there because it could lead to bias, or maybe that's something I want to decrease the importance of. So definitely many tools to do that. And similarly, if you Bing or Google or DuckDuckGo Google AI principles, you'll be able to find those as well.
Yeah, I think we have to be careful about bias. I'll give you a historical example, but in the early days of the internet, and I won't name the search engine, if you were to type in, tell me about French military victories, it would come back and say, did you mean French military defeats? And then it would actually list all the French military defeats. We have to be careful because you can be subtle and discriminate. And this is going to be a new era that we're going to have to pay attention to this really from the foundation and build our systems where we can put a bright light on it and identify it when it occurs. Great question.
And I think that's the right question to be asking, right? Especially if you're a startup and you don't need to wait till you're doing your first AI project to try and figure out if you've got issues in your data with bias, right? Now is the time to start doing that now. Because if you're waiting until you're ready to pursue your AI project, you're just adding that much more lead time to the successful deployment of your first solution.
So that's another startup company. Companies helping other companies find bias. Okay. Yes, sir.
I have a question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Up here. Up.
Up. Yes.
He did it. Hi. I'm really glad you mentioned that we're getting really comfortable with AI. You know, right now it's kind of the wild, wild west as far as consumer-facing AI goes. From the panel's perspective, we talked a bit about bias, but I'd love to hear from a stakeholder perspective, like who gets hurt and what's at stake when we don't handle data and generative AI with integrity?
I'll start with that one. I would say there's a lot at stake. I think if we want to talk generally across consumer and enterprise products, I think we've seen it already. I think we've seen issues with copyright. I think we've seen issues with IP. I think we've seen issues with privacy as well. If an unknowing employee that doesn't know the risks of a public site like ChatGPT or Bard puts personal PHI information in there, or PCI information, or social security numbers, it can be a leak of information there. I think on the other side as well, looking at if you're inside of your own environment and you're worrying about the risk of bias, it can lead to anything from discrimination based on demographics all the way over to potentially ill-made decisions on whether it be credit or whether it be something else as well. So I think there is a lot at risk, which is why I know I take this very seriously and very personally, and I know both of our companies do from that perspective. But I would say, frankly, the risk is practically limitless in terms of that, which is why it's important to take these mitigation factors.
Okay, we have 2 minutes left and 3 questions to go. So lightning round, we're going to answer very quickly, but ask very quickly.
Hi, my name is Austin, and I've been building automations with Microsoft Power Automate over the last couple months. And I noticed that the AI-driven functionality of it is still limited to discrete tasks. And my question to both of you is, are Google and Microsoft aiming to create a variant of AI that mirrors the general intelligence of humans?
It's a good question.
Lightning round.
Probably.
Good.
Probably as well.
Good. Next question. Well done.
Awesome. So I'm Lisa Carter. I have a question I think is similar to a lot of the innovators here. So could you speak to like cyber protections when operating in this global space, in this global market, in ways that, similar to his question, how we can retain that authenticity and individuality with our businesses?
That is an hour-long conversation,
Oh,
but
Lord.
lightning round, go ahead.
Yeah. Govern your data, take security measures, do all the things that you normally do to protect your data. That still applies with AI.
Agreed. One step further, there is also a whole security section that can last 90 minutes about use fire against fire. There are obviously bad actors in the world as well that are using generative AI to write, whether it be Nigerian prince emails or whether it be ways to get inside of your system. So beware there and use the tools to your best to protect.
Just a quick question here. I've played around with the DaVinci API with OpenAI. Has there been any progress with hallucination where the AI will fill in gaps when it comes to data sets?
Good question.
Yep. So the models like DaVinci, right, typically have configuration available for them for you to decide, how much hallucination do you want, right? Because there's times where you want it to hallucinate. If I want to come up with like a catchy jingle for my ice cream shop, right, you want it to hallucinate all over the place probably, right? But when we're trying to figure out, hey, I want to feed you like a list of medical symptoms, and then I want you to give me like, what do you think the most likely diagnosis is, right? You don't want a lot of hallucination there, right? And so being able to configure that is something that is being built into those models.
Okay. Go ahead.
Yep, I would say I agree. Make sure you look at the parameters and the abilities that you have to shift, whether it be the temperature of models, the top K, the top P, such forth, in order to make sure you tune to the level of hallucination that you're willing to accept as a business.
Very good. Could we get a round of applause for these two guys?